Hello, and welcome to the Water Buffs podcast, featuring in-depth interviews with experts discussing water problems and solutions. You'll find the audio version of this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. The video version is available on YouTube and Vimeo. Water Buffs is a production of The Water Desk, an independent journalism initiative based at the University of Colorado Boulder's Center for Environmental Journalism. Stay tuned until the end for more information. We hope you enjoy the show.
We're in climate crisis. Something urgently needs to change. And so why not allow the original peoples of this landscape, those that understand water, to be in those leadership positions?
Hello, and welcome to the Water Buffs podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Tobin, director of the Water Desk at the University of Colorado's Center for Environmental Journalism. I'm excited to be speaking today to Julia Bernal, director of the Pueblo Action Alliance in New Mexico. Julia is an enrolled tribal member at Sandia Pueblo and is also from Taos Pueblo and the Yuchi Creek Nations of Oklahoma. Julia is an expert and advocate on New Mexico water issues, and her work focuses on oil and gas development. She has a BA in English and Literature from the University of Redlands. Currently, she is working on a dual degree master's program in water resources and community regional planning at the University of New Mexico. In 2014, Julia obtained a Water Resources Technician certificate from the Bureau of Indian Affairs through the Native American Water Corps. Welcome to the show, Julia. It's great to have you join us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me today.
You're welcome. To begin with, it would be great to just learn a little bit more about Pueblo Action Alliance. What is the mission of the organization and what types of advocacy work do you do?
Yes, thank you for the question. Pueblo Action Alliance is a Pueblo-centric grassroots organization, and our purpose is to address a lot of the cultural sustainability issues that directly impact our communities. So issues around climate, water, extractive industries, all of these different impacts that threaten our cultural integrity is the reason why we have started this organization and why we have always centered a youth voice and in terms of Pueblo community mobilization, because it's inherently our futures that we have to plan for and should have the ability to plan for. And so we are located in Southern Tiwa Territory, otherwise known as Albuquerque, New Mexico, but the issues that we cover span across mainly northern New Mexico.
Mm-hmm. On your website, you say that you're descendants of Pueblo revolutionaries and carry the revolutionary spirit of the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. For those in the audience who are not familiar with the region's history, tell us a little bit about the Pueblo Revolt and your connection to that event more than 3 centuries ago.
So the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 was essentially the first revolution on so-called American soil. Pueblo people were essentially colonized a bit later than like the eastern coast of the so-called US. And we were first impacted by Spanish conquest, Spanish Inquisition. And this happened in the mid 1500s. And so, fast forward a century later, we are experiencing basically like the peak of colonialism, not being able to practice our traditional ways of life or any sort of type of activity that was viewed as pagan. And so the Pueblo communities formed an alliance together to organize a direct action against Spanish occupation. This was led by the leader Pope and other leaders from different pueblos, and it was a revolution that was won. We were successful in that revolution and, had peace for maybe about 20 years before Spanish settlers came back into the region and had essentially like peace treaties with the Pueblos, and that's how the land grant communities basically started. But we acknowledge this point in our history because we are still fighting against extensions of colonialism, whether that's in the extractive industries or just the oppression of inherent Indigenous sovereignty. Um, as a a culmination of many other issues that our community faces. And so we feel that it's important for us to talk about this history as a means to empower us and as a means for this history to remain relevant. And so if we are continuously talking about revolution and about this act of liberation for Pueblo Indigenous people, then we feel like we can continue that revolutionary spirit into the issues today and achieve the ultimate goal of liberation.
Hmm. So you grew up along the Rio Grande. What changes to the river have you seen in your lifetime?
Well, the decrease in the water table is probably the most significant change over my short life here. I also, learned accounts from my elders who knew the river before the construction of Cochiti Dam, and um, it allowed for different ecosystems to form because of that, natural flooding and overbanking, and so, now I've never seen the river this low in my life before. Last I took a picture in September, and it was at in Albuquerque at the Rio Grande Nature Center. And usually that stretch of the tributary is very abundant, and has a higher a flow, but this year it was very decreased. And there's different parts in Sandia where me and my siblings used to like to hang out, and because they would create these like beautiful swales and encourage other types of native habitat, but we haven't really seen that for the past couple of years now. And so those that maybe are in denial of impacts to climate change definitely need to start observing and being with the natural world because it is changing.
Hmm. So you mentioned the impacts of climate change. What are the effects that we're already seeing in New Mexico due to warming and climate change?
So New Mexico is traditionally a semi-arid to an arid environment. And so, that's why we have the different seasons here in New Mexico. But because of climate change, we're seeing an increase in temperature. So a lot longer summers, a lot shorter winters, and that's impacting our snow accumulation in our headwaters. And so the best way to store water is in snowpack. And so now, because of this decrease in snow accumulation, it's actually causing higher evaporation rates to happen throughout the basin. And so um, we are now having to think a little bit more deeply about how we're going to store water for future use, because traditionally a lot of these reservoirs are concrete bottoms and are kind of sitting in these very high temperature places, like if you look at the Colorado River, you have like Lake Mead and Lake Powell, and their evaporation rates have been increasingly drastic throughout the past 4 or 5 years. Same thing is happening in New Mexico. And so we're having to think about, if we're having a decrease in storage, and like how is that going to affect everybody downstream. So how is that going to affect Pueblo prior and paramount water rights? Is it going, how is it going to impact our delivery obligation to Texas and Mexico? and also just like supplying urban areas like Albuquerque, which is it's essentially trying to bring more populations to come and live in Albuquerque. So it's going to put another big stress on our water resources. And so, those are just some of the issues relating to climate change. But this is again like an emerging science. And so I'm sure we're going to see other issues coming out of a decrease in snowpack.
Mm-hmm. And are indigenous communities in New Mexico particularly vulnerable to these climate change impacts?
Yes, absolutely. And it's not just like on an economic level; it's a cultural level as well. We our belief systems are attached, connected to land and water. That's our culture revolves around our land and water. Our languages are based around land and water, and so we can't separate the two. And so as we are experiencing impacts to our natural world and that essentially is a direct impact to our culture. And so I believe that any indigenous community that is feeling the impacts of climate change are frontline communities. Maybe we don't live right next to oil and gas, or maybe we don't live right next to uranium mining, but the impacts to our water is impacts to our culture, and same thing with our land issues. And there's a statistic going around about indigenous people being a fifth of the world population, but protecting 80% of the biodiversity. And so innately and through original instructions, we have been the original conservationists and stewards of these landscapes and protect biodiversity, which allows for natural cycles of carbon sequestration. And so I think in order for us to mitigate climate change, we have to protect biodiversity rather than creating all kinds of other energy investments and technologies that just don't really make sense.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the low levels in the Rio Grande, climate change impacts. What are some of the other threats and challenges that are facing New Mexico's water resources?
Well, I mentioned a little bit about urbanization. And so the more people that we have to supply water to, the more strain it's going to have on the aquifer and on our water, on our surface water. And so people don't normally associate like urbanization as something that is perpetuated by climate change, but it ultimately is, because as you're seeing drastic changes in climate, you have people moving from certain areas. COVID was also a reason why people were starting to move to Albuquerque or New Mexico in general, because they had lower COVID rates. We had like our cost of living is a lot lower over here because nobody really paid attention to New Mexico only until recently. But that in itself is a climate stressor, because we are experiencing already a stress from rising temperatures. But if you're adding in greater populations of people, that's another stress associated with it. And so I like to bring this up because for indigenous nations like mine, we're sandwiched right in between like Albuquerque, Rio Rancho, Bernal, these very populous areas. And so what kind of impact is that going to have on our cultural resources, on our in-stream flow? Because a lot of water that runs through certain areas are sacred sites. And we need that river flow to keep those areas healthy. So that's something that I don't really think it's all talked about a lot with issues around climate change, but increased urbanization is definitely a contributor.
This is Water Words, a fast explanation of a bit of water lingo. I'm Hannah Lee Myers. Today's water word is potable water. Put simply, potable water is water that's safe to drink. According to the Water Education Foundation, potable water can come from surface and ground sources and is treated to levels that meet state and federal standards for consumption. In the U.S., the EPA set standards for how clean water needs to be considered potable. States, tribes, local governments, and water providers then routinely check water systems for illness-causing pollutants. So, where does potable water come from? Well, besides traditional sources like lakes, rivers, and groundwater wells, there are two main systems for reusing wastewater. Indirect potable reuse, where treated wastewater is released into an environmental source, like a lake, groundwater aquifer, or reservoir, for a period of time, before that water is then treated at a water treatment plant. The second system is direct potable reuse, where treated wastewater goes directly to the water treatment plant. No environmental buffer. With water scarcity becoming a major issue in most of the West and around the world, there's a lot of interest in developing new and innovative ways to recycle and purify wastewater for potable uses. Multiple filtration technologies, ultraviolet light, hydrogen peroxide, ozone gas, and other methods are all being put to use to dramatically increase the percentage of wastewater recycled into potable water each year. So if you hear the term potable water and you think drinking water and all the systems that go into making sure that water is safe for consumption, you're correctly imagining potable water. Now back to the Water Buffs podcast.
Tell us a little bit about the problems with access to safe drinking water in New Mexico, particularly on indigenous lands.
Yeah, well, New Mexico has a long history and legacy of extraction, whether that has to do with oil and gas or uranium or even copper, hard rock mineral mining. It's a resource rich state, and so we've experienced this legacy of extraction that has predominantly been near indigenous communities. And these industries also use quite a bit of water for their production. So we've seen a lot of impacts to groundwater aquifers, especially like in the San Juan Basin, or we call it the Greater Chaco region. Many produced spills have happened in this region that have definitely compromised shallow groundwater aquifers. We have water contamination from mine spills, like a big one was the Gold King mines spill, that happened some years ago. And then, down here in the middle Rio Grande, we have impacts to our water resources by the effluent that's released from the utility. There's lots of different things that is in that water, and once it comes out of the city system, downstream is Isleta Pueblo, and Isleta Pueblo has actually had won a landmark case to sue the city for not abiding by stricter water quality standards. And this is just prevalent from all over Indian country, not just Pueblos, but Navajo and Hopi nations as well in the Southwest. And so we have to address, again, this historic legacy of extraction because, for over a century now, we have been fighting against industry to clean up the mess that they created. because it's impacting community health and environmental health, and also cultural health as well.
Hmm. So, how has racism and colonialism played into all of these water problems that we've been discussing?
Yeah, so it's a known history that there were designated sacrifice zones throughout the U.S. for extraction for oil and gas or uranium, and um, a lot of communities have been within these designated national sacrifice zones. The Greater Chaco region being one of them. Um, and this was all to forward oil and gas production. And so, um, if you're if you're designating areas of sacrifice that have predominantly high populations of indigenous communities or Black, Indigenous, or people of color communities, which you see happening across the US, that in itself is environmental racism. We we are viewed as expendable. We are viewed as we are just in the way of industry progression and production. And so that's something that our organization, like Pueblo Action Alliance, have been trying to bring more awareness to, is that Indigenous nations have inherent sovereignty, and our sovereignty is being undermined by not just the federal government, but our state governments as well. Um, because we haven't made just transition to renewable energies. We're still trying to crutch the fossil fuel economy by bringing in other greenwash or false solutions into these market-based strategies. And so and the Indigenous voice and leadership has been completely ignored during a lot of these processes. And so it ultimately is a continuation of colonialism, because we Indigenous peoples before first contact had very sophisticated economies and societal values that brought dimensions of reciprocity and respect for the natural world, therefore had certain ecological ceilings. And that's not the case with the way our capitalist economy runs. We extract to create surplus, and that is causing an imbalance. The West has no water and the eastern states have too much water. There's an imbalance happening here. And so colonialism has definitely like oppressed and suppressed Indigenous worldview. And now we're facing climate crisis, and there's a cry out for traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous science, and so we feel like this is just an extension of that colonial project, to consume and give nothing back.
Hmm. And you mentioned oil and gas development in the Greater Chaco region in northwest New Mexico. In terms of the impacts on water resources, is it that those operations are polluting the water, using up too much of the water, both? How is it affecting water resources in that region?
Yeah, so it's a combination of both, because you don't have surface water. Well, first of all, for surface water allocation, it's already over allocated. So you're if you're trying to get a surface water right, good luck. That probably won't happen. But if you want to get a groundwater pumping permit, that's probably like the easiest thing that you can do. You can apply for a permit at the Office State of Engineer. They'll say, okay, you have 9 acre feet to use a year, and there's no real-time data of how much water is actually being used from groundwater aquifers. I mean, they have certain reports that come out every 5 years of how much water, surface or groundwater, each county is using, but we really don't know how much water is being used for oil and gas production. um, and so same thing with a stress to quantity. The issue around quality is also there, because if you're pumping a groundwater aquifer and you're actually streamlining this infiltration process. So anything that's on the surface will, slowly percolate depending on what type of aquifer it is. It'll slowly percolate down into the ground. And so if you're pumping, just imagine like a straw, you're sucking up all the liquid and it's kind of going down really fast. Well, you're also pulling a bunch of contamination into the aquifer that is streamlining its natural process of infiltration. Um, and then also, as mentioned before, produce water spills or any other type of minor or major point source of contamination is ultimately going to be affecting the groundwater aquifers. And we've seen that in many areas in the Chaco region, where there's been very, very shallow groundwater aquifers, produced spills have happened, and so they're compromised, they're contaminated, and you can't undo something like that. So it's pretty serious, but it's a huge region. And so, you're thinking like, oh, it's just happening here in this isolated area. It's not. It's like, it's thousands of wells that could be potentially threatening groundwater quality and quantity.
Hmm. So the Pueblo Action Alliance has campaigns that are called Land Back and Water Back. Tell us a little bit about those efforts and what they seek to achieve.
Yeah, so Land Back is this global movement of asserting Indigenous worldview and stewardship and conservation. Before colonial sort of governance structures were implemented in this area, there was a respect for certain territories. Um, there are areas that were used by many different tribes, and so there was this there weren't like geopolitical borders that constituted like certain jurisdictional boundaries. It was just about, again, respect and reciprocity with communities in the natural world. And so land back isn't about obtaining like property ownership. It's about the resurgence of Indigenous worldview on how we're taking care of our land and our cultural resources. And so for our region in the Southwest, we're facing issues not just around land, but water. We can't, grow anything on the land without our water. And so, Indigenous peoples have had very sophisticated water management strategies before colonial contact, whether that was groundwater capture or irrigation systems that diverted water from runoff during certain times of the year, and also we have spiritual connections to water. A lot of our ceremonies are rooted in asking for rain and asking for abundance and good luck from that rain. That in itself is a water management strategies because it works. Our songs and dances bring rain. It is people have seen it, witnessed it with their own eyes. And so we haven't been able to assert that worldview into like dominant water paradigms. And so water back is again this assertion and resurgence of Indigenous worldview and water management strategies, but it's also about rematriation. And rematriation is essentially asserting balance between communities in the natural world. It's not like the opposite of repatriation. It's not about asserting a matriarch. It's about maintaining and retaining balance with each other. And so with land back, it's essentially an opportunity and a space for us to think deeply about what it means to decolonize our water.
Mhm. And I know that you have argued that it's not only critical for Indigenous people to have more input on water management policies, but also particularly women. Say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I'm a Pueblo woman, Tiwa woman, and I have innate cultural relationships to water. Women are water carriers. Our river is a river mother, and so we have these innate connections that help us understand how water should be treated. I feel like if we asserted personhood back to our river, we might treat her a little bit differently. Um, but the water world has been predominantly dominated by cis men, white men, and we've seen a lot of mismanagement and misallocation of water. And so if we're talking about like paradigm shifts in terms of water planning or management, then this process of rematriation really needs to happen. And Pueblo women should be advocating more to be in these water spaces because of our worldview, our care and our care for our communities and our water mother. And so these worldviews are directly in conflict with what the dominant paradigm proposes now. And we're in climate crisis. Something urgently needs to change. And so why not allow the original peoples of this landscape, though those that understand water, to be in those leadership positions to help shape future management strategies that are rooted in equity, are rooted in community, and rooted in, again, reciprocity with the natural world.
Mhm. You mentioned the idea of personhood for rivers. Explain that and what that actually means.
Well, a lot of indigenous thought and ideology view living entities as mothers. So, we view the earth as a mother. It's no different from our waterways. Here in the Middle Rio Grande, we view our river mother. She has a name. She is feminine presenting. That is our traditional worldview. Um, and so if we were again asserting an indigenous worldview, then we would be viewing our rivers as mothers rather than as a commodity or a resource or, whatever we're categorizing water today, again, directly conflicts with indigenous worldview. But it's about values. We don't have very strong values about um, how we allocate or treat our water resources. And indigenous values put that respect on the natural world. We view the natural world as, ultimate creation, as something that gives us abundance. Whatever we take from the natural world, we must give back. That's reciprocity. There's many other cultures across the globe that believe in this worldview as well. And so asserting worldview to a waterway would just be another resurgence of indigenous worldview.
Mm-hmm. So, what are the big stories that you're expecting related to water in 2022 in New Mexico?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of there's some political movement happening around water right now. We recently had our state engineer step down from his position and now have appointed, or the governor of our state has appointed a new water advisor. And so I think that it speaks to the fact that our state isn't providing like adequate funding for the office state engineer to function adequately and bring people on to really think about like climate resiliency in the region. And so we're hoping that the new water advisor could listen more to grassroots and indigenous communities and organizations that are really thinking deeply again about what shifts need to happen in water management. We need to focus on climate. We need to focus on storage and delivery allocations, and figure out new and innovative and creative ways to accomplish those goals, because ultimately the challenges that we face is decreasing water, and that is going to for lack of better terms, that's really going to freak people out because, you turn your water faucet on, you're not really thinking about like where that source is, or, everybody knows that the Rio Grande has always been like a low flow river. But what's going to happen when people see that water isn't running through the river anymore, or there's going to be different types of subsidies to use less water, So I'm hoping that in 2022, there's more involvement with Indigenous nations, with grassroots, again, and Indigenous organizations like ours to help shape management strategies that are effective and meaningful.
Well, this has been really fascinating. Is there anything else that you want folks to know about New Mexico water issues and your work?
I think just that the movement led by Indigenous people to be leaders in decisions around climate and water is not just beneficial for us, but it's beneficial for everyone because we come from systems that are rooted in traditional core values. And so I don't want people to undermine the importance of values that are implemented around our waterways, because that is ultimately how we're going to manage our water in the future. And so if there's ever opportunities to help shape values and bring more Indigenous people into those spaces to shape values, then I would recommend that people do so.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking time to chat with us, Julia. I've really enjoyed the conversation and learning about your work.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks for tuning in to the Water Buffs podcast, available in audio and video formats on most major media platforms. Water Buffs is a production of The Water Desk, an independent journalism initiative based at the University of Colorado Boulder's Center for Environmental Journalism. You can learn more about us and about water issues at waterdesk.org. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you have a comment or have a question, please feel free to email us at waterdesk@colorado.edu. Special thanks to the executive producer and co-manager, Hannah Lee Myers, and to our graphic designer and co-developer, Jeff McGee. Be sure to check out our other episodes, and until next time, thanks for tuning in.